It was the single most expensive military project of World War II, costing 50% more than the Manhattan Project to build the atomic bomb, and is the only aircraft to drop nuclear weapons in combat. The B-29 was the most sophisticated propeller-driven bomber of World War II, and it brought a new wave of technology, from pressurized cabins to its use of radar powered by the cavity magnetron, which I spoke about a couple of videos ago, that changed not only warplanes but also the future of commercial ones too. However, the US military was in a hurry. It needed a super bomber to replace the B-17 and fast. First to fight the Germans, but after Pearl Harbor, it was almost exclusively used against the Japanese across the vast distances of the Pacific, because it was the only bomber that could reach the Japanese mainland in large numbers and with equally large bomb loads. Because of this rush, mistakes were made, not least with the Curtis-Wright engines used to power them. Of the 414 B-29s lost during the Japanese bombing offensive, 147 were down by enemy action, and 267 were due to engine fires, mechanical failures, takeoff crashes, and other operational losses. The grim joke amongst the aircrew was that Curtis-Wright would more likely kill them than the Japanese. So how did the most advanced bomber of the war end up with such a grim reputation? And how did the NACA, the predecessor to NASA, help fix the problems? As you may well know, I do a lot of history videos like this one. But what about the history of you and me? Who were our ancestors? Where did they come from? And what did they do? I've attempted to build a family tree before, but to be honest, I didn't get much farther than my grandparents, and not being in the same area as the rest of my family, it was just a pain to research. So when I partnered with MyHeritage, it was a chance to finally get somewhere with my family tree. MyHeritage is the #1 family history service and offers a range of facilities to help you build your family tree in a fun, easy way, especially if you're like me and don't have a great deal of information to go on, as it has access to over 19 billion records. My dad had me when he was 62 and he was born in 1899, so everything on my dad's side was over 100 years old and back in the 1800s. So far, I've gotten farther with MyHeritage than anything else. From my father, I found my grandparents, and then my great-grandparents, and then my great-great-grandparents back to 1814 with the Research This Person link. I didn't know much about my mother's parents either. She didn't have any links showing up on the site, but her brother, my uncle, did show up in the records, which were part of my cousin's family tree, who is also on MyHeritage, and I didn't know anything about it. From here, I could find my great-grandparents on my mother's side too. MyHeritage will also try to find matches with other family trees, like it did with my cousins, and official records using the record matches and smart matches. The more accurate the dates and the information you enter, the more likely it will find new matches and expand your family tree. You can also add old photos of relatives so your family tree will look better and you can navigate it more easily. You can also colorize black and white photos using the colorize tool to see what it will look like in a more modern color style. Sign up now for the 14-day free trial to enjoy all the amazing features that MyHeritage has to offer. And if you decide to continue with your subscription, you'll get a 50% discount using the following link in the description below and in the first pinned comment. During World War II, the press and the US military heaped praise on the Boeing B29 Superfortress as the saviour that would win the war, and while some in the Navy and the Army might disagree, there was no doubt that it was an effective weapon system. Its range and low capacity brought the mass bombing raids which had been used successfully against Nazi Germany to the once thought safe Japanese home islands, which decimated not only Japanese industry but many of their major cities and towns, and in the end the atomic bombs that brought the war to a rapid close. But behind the scenes there were long-standing problems with the engines that powered the plane that meant for the crew of the B-29s almost every takeoff was a careful balancing act of getting the heavily loaded aircraft into the air without burning up the engines. This would continue when cruising and also getting home too. The story of the B-29 goes back to the mid-1930s when the United States Army Air Corps, or the USAAC, were looking for a heavy bomber that had superior strength, bomb load, speed and range. The result was the B-17 Flying Fortress. It had all of these apart from range. The USAAC wanted a range of 5,000 miles, but the B-17 could only manage about 2,000 miles or 3,200 kilometres with a 6,000 pound or 2,700 kilogram bomb load. But if Britain were ever to fall to the Nazis, then the British airfields wouldn't be available, and bombers would have to fly directly from the US to hit Germany, too far for the B-17's combat range, and if a war in the Pacific were to start, that would also rule out the B-17. Such was the need for a new bomber that 1,600 were ordered before the prototypes were even built, which laid the path for the problems ahead. In February 1940, flying prototype orders were placed for a very heavy, very long-range bomber to replace the B-17 that could fly from the US to Germany with a 10,000 pound or 4,500 kilogram bomb load. Although 4 aircraft makers were approached, only 2 made prototypes, Boeing and Consolidated Aircraft. Boeing had been working on a pressurized heavy bomber since 1938 and immediately started adapting their design for the new requirements. Consolidated developed what became the Consolidated B-32 Dominator as a backup in case the Boeing design could not be realized, but it was nowhere near as sophisticated as the Boeing. It would also be bigger, fly higher and faster than any other bomber, including the British Avro Lancaster, with a flight ceiling of 31,850 feet and a maximum speed of up to 357 miles an hour or 575 kilometers per hour. The B-29, as it would come to be known, had a pressurized cabin, a first for a bomber. It had remote control gun turrets, analog fire computers that would allow for airspeed, lead, gravity, temperature and humidity, and allowed one gunner to operate 2 guns remotely and carry a crew of up to 11. It would also make extensive use of radar using the newly developed cavity magnetron. This was particularly crucial in the Pacific, where tropical weather conditions could be unpredictable and often adverse. Radar-assisted bombing enabled B-29s to conduct high-altitude precision bombing raids on Japanese cities and industrial targets with less than ideal visibility. It was also important in the vast expanses of the Pacific Ocean, where the lack of easily recognizable landmarks made navigation a challenge. If a plane got separated from its bombing group, it was all too easy to get lost in the Pacific, and some B-29s did. Radar-equipped B-29s could use their systems for ground mapping, allowing them to determine their position relative to islands, coastlines, and other geographical features. The B-29s were also equipped with tail-warning radars, which would alert the gunners to approaching enemy aircraft from the rear, enhancing the bomber's defensive capabilities. However, all this extra equipment added a lot of weight and required a lot of power, which would put further stress on the engines. Much of this technology was newly developed. The B-29's gunnery system, for example, was centralized. Gunners used sighting stations within the plane rather than sitting next to the guns themselves, which limited their field of view. The system used analog computers to direct the 4 gun turrets, each having 2 50 caliber machine guns, allowing multiple turrets to concentrate fire onto a single target. But the multiple sighting stations had to be precisely calibrated and synchronized, and if the system fell out of sync, which it did occasionally, it could cause aiming difficulties. All of this made it the heaviest bomber of the war, coming in at an empty weight of 74,500 pounds or 33,793 kilograms, twice the weight of a Lancaster bomber. And it had a maximum takeoff weight of 135,000 pounds or 61,000 kilograms with combat overload. To do this, each B-29 was fitted with 4 of the most powerful aero engines, which at the time was the Curtis-Wright R-3350 duplex cyclone radial engine producing 2,200 horsepower each. Even with these engines, it was going to be hard work getting a fully loaded B-29 off the ground. The Curtis-Wright R-3350 Cyclone was an air-cooled, supercharged, twin-row 18-cylinder 54.9 litre radial engine, which means it had 2 rows of 9 cylinders spread radially around a centre gearbox, and had been developed in competition against the 18-cylinder Pratt & Whitney double Wasp 44 litre engine. At the time, there was very little demand from airliners for these big engines, and as such they received much less development compared to their smaller versions, which would be fitted into medium bombers in volume. However, in 1940, when 3 out of the 4 super heavy bomber designs came back, they specified the R-3350 Cyclone, and it was then seen as the future engine for Army aviation. The pressure was now on to make it into a reliable production engine, but there were still several areas which caused problems when fitted to the B-29. The biggest of this was its tendency to rapidly overheat the rear cylinders because of the restricted space between the cylinder baffles, which is the metalwork to guide incoming cool air around the cylinders, and the cowling around the front of the engine. This could cause mechanical failure or fire. When the first XB-29 prototype flew on the 21st of September 1942, everything went as expected, with a relatively uneventful flight. But things didn't stay that way, and over the next few months there were very few uneventful test flights. By December 28, 1942, there had been 16 engine changes, 22 carburation changes, and 19 exhaust system revisions. The average test flight time was just 1 hour and 10 minutes, with most of that time fighting problems and getting back to base. Further issues put the number 1 prototype out of action for 7 months. On the 30th of December 1942, the maiden flight of number 2 prototype took place. Within 6 minutes, number 4 engine overheated and caught fire. Even though the top test pilot, Eddie Allen, cut the fuel and used the fire extinguishers, the fire continued. The flight was terminated, and the plane only just made it back, with serious damage to the nacelle and wing, and the crew suffered from heavy smoke entering the cabin from the bomb bay. On later inspection, it was found that a fire had just started in number 1 engine, and number 3 was close to failure. All 3 of the failed engines had only 3 hours total ground and flight time. But worse was to come on the 18th of February 1943, when Eddie and his crew took number 2 prototype to get climb and level flight performance and engine cooling data. Just after takeoff, number 1 engine caught fire, and the plane radioed that they were coming back to the field, but the wing was on fire and smoke was in the cabin. 3 of the forward crew jumped from the plane, but at just 250 feet, it was too low for their parachutes to open. 3 miles from Boeing Field, the plane crashed into the Frey meatpacking factory, killing all on board, plus 20 people on the ground. Burns on the bodies of the 3 crew that bailed showed that the fire had spread to the cabin. As time went by, problems with engine fires continued, and the blame game went backwards and forwards between Boeing blaming Curtis-Wright for poor engine design and Curtis-Wright blaming Boeing for poor airflow due to the design of the nacelles and cowls. As the war in the Pacific increased, the pressure to create a workable super bomber meant that even after the prototyping stage and production had started, there were so many changes to the early planes that as they were rolled out of a factory, they went straight into facilities that would start modifying and rebuilding them. As part of making the engines lighter, they used a lot of magnesium in the content. But if an engine fire got out of hand, the magnesium could start to combust, reaching temperatures of up to 3,000 degrees Celsius, which could burn through the ineffective firewall, which the crew called tin pans, and then the aluminium wing spar just behind the nacelle in seconds. The high temperature of these fires also helped destroy the evidence of the root cause of the fires. On engines which failed but did survive intact, it was found that the exhaust valves were failing and being ingested into the engine, and it became common to replace the cylinder heads after just a few hours of operation. The pressure to get B-29s into combat meant that overheating continued to occur once in operation in the Pacific. The overheating issues were compounded by the temperatures on the runways in the tropics, which meant that the planes only had a short window of time to get into the air and cool the engines, any more than 20 minutes idling on the ground, and they were too hot to take off. The climb to altitude was also an ordeal which put the crew and often combat weight overloaded B-29s in a tricky position of having to constantly keep an eye on the cylinder head temperatures whilst balancing the engine cowl flaps that diverted more cooling air for the engines. Too little and they would overheat, too much and they would increase the drag like an air brake, and in some cases when the flaps stuck open it could make the plane almost unflyable. Flying at altitude over Japan, they also encountered the then unknown jet stream, creating 200-mile-an-hour headwinds which slowed the progress over the target to a crawl, making them an easy target for the enemy and putting more pressure on the already overloaded engines. To try and get to the root cause of the overheating problems, in June 1944 a B-29 was sent to the NACA, the predecessor to NASA, at the Aircraft Engine Research Laboratory, now NASA Glenn, in Cleveland, Ohio. After ground and flight tests, wind tunnel testing and pulling the engines apart, they found the cylinder heads didn't allow for enough heat dissipation, which caused the exhaust valves to fail. They designed a new, longer cylinder head that would disperse the heat better and change the metallurgy of the inlet valves. The exhaust area was also found not to be getting enough airflow, so they added baffles to direct more air and changes to the cowl flaps to work more effectively without causing more drag. The inlet manifolds were also found not to be distributing fuel evenly between the cylinders, which could cause lean burning in some of them to backfire into the magnesium supercharger impeller, igniting fuel in the casing and in worst cases starting a magnesium fire. A new fuel injection system directly into the cylinder heads replaced the carburetors, and a new impeller was developed to reduce the potential for induction system fires. The various modifications were done to the two engines which were fitted to the left wing of a B-29, and in tests they proved that with proper fuel mixture and cowl flap settings, the engines attained the maximum range on each flight, and that performance increased by 38% during the periods of maximum cooling, which the NACA estimated could add 10,000 feet of altitude or 35,000 pounds of payload. Problems still occurred, but they were significantly reduced, though the average lifetime of an R-3350 was just 265 hours before replacement. In early 1945, the new man in charge of the 21st Bomber Command in the Marianas Islands, General Curtis LeMay, ordered the removal of most of the defensive armour and the remote control guns from the B-29s under his command. This came as their role changed from high-altitude daytime bombing with high-explosive bombs to low-altitude nighttime raids with incendiaries, and the weight saved could go on more fuel and bomb loads. The modified aircraft had the same reduced defensive firepower as the atomic weapons delivery intended silver plate B-29 aircraft. With the modifications, the stress on the engines and the failure rate dropped, and the B-29 became a more reliable bomber, though it wouldn't be around for that much longer, as on the 28th of May 1946, the last B-29 was produced at Boeing's Renton factory, and as the war ended, orders for over 5,000 B-29s were cancelled. The production run had lasted just over 3.5 years from the first prototype to the last one off the line, one of the shortest of any military aircraft. After the war, the B-29D was developed and eventually redesignated as the B-50 Superfortress. This dropped the Curtis-Wright engines in favour of the even larger and more powerful Pratt & Whitney R-3360 Wasp major radials. Other improvements included a new aluminium alloy that made the wings lighter and stronger and allowed the weight of the aircraft to go up to 40,000 kilos and an additional 3,600 kilograms of bombs to be added externally. Although 200 B-50s were ordered in 1945, only 78 were built, With the advent of a Convair B-36 Peacemaker in 1949, it was downgraded from a heavy bomber to a medium bomber. However, the program and the subsequent B-54, which never made it past the design stage, was unpopular with Curtis LeMay, by now the commander of the Strategic Air Command, or SAC, as being inferior to the B-36 Peacemaker and having little capacity for further improvement, and it was eventually dropped in 1949. While the bomber was vindicated in the end, with many successful variants and special operations after the war, and many of the surviving crew looking upon the B-29 with great fondness, regarding it as the Cadillac of aircraft, the journey from first prototype to the last one made was one of the most torturous of any major US military aircraft project. So I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, then please thumbs up, share and subscribe, and a big thanks go to all of our patrons for their ongoing support.